and then try to understand it from that perspective, rather than to think, for example, well, it's a collection of superstitions that we've somehow outgrown. It's like, no, it's just, sorry, that's not a deep enough analysis, because it's got some truth, but it doesn't take into account the fact that the propositions still stand at the foundation of our culture. It doesn't address Nietzsche's central concern, which is that if you blow out the notion of God, the entire structure crumbles. You know, and you can debate that, fine. But I'd, you know, just assume that you debated it with Nietzsche, because he's a pretty tough customer to tangle with. So, and I don't think the atheist types, insofar as there's a type, I don't think they've wrestled with the real problems. So, yeah.
So I appreciate you set out some ground rules, keep things rational, and I think that's going to help us. What I'm wondering is, so for instance, you had said elsewhere, the New Testament, from what you can see, it's psychologically correct, and that's, you know, quite astounding, I would say. There's a lot of truth, and in your depictions of these stories elsewhere, you've pointed out like deep truths, you know, real powerful. So what my question would be is, if we can say Nietzsche took like an order of magnitude of you know, intelligence and, you know, depth to be able to predict what would happen in the next century, you know, rationally, if the Bible's not the inherent word of God, what's going on?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. I mean, I'm going to try to answer that rationally. But as we move forward, but as I said, I don't want to leave people with the notion, because, you know, in some ways, this is something I've thought about, what I've been thinking about for a long time, is I can't tell if I'm like an advocate of the religious viewpoint or its worst possible critic, because I am doing my best to make it rational, and there's a reductionistic element to that, but I think that I'm doing that while also leaving the door open to things that I don't understand, because I know that there's more to this story than I understand or can understand. And I'm laying out what I can understand, and I'm making it rational. But I do not believe for an instant that that exhausts the realm. It's like there are ways of interpreting these stories that work in the conceptual universe we inhabit right now. But there's a lot of things that we don't understand. And one thing I've found about digging into these stories is that the deeper you dig, the more you find. And that's that's one of the things that convinced me that there was more to them than I had originally suspected, because things would click and I'd think, wow, that's really something. And then I would take it apart further and I'd think, oh, well, I thought that was something, but this is even more remarkable. It just keeps opening and opening. And so I'm going to make it rational. I'm going to try to provide an answer to, and it is, I think you're right about speaking about Nietzsche and his capacity for prophecy, and Dostoevsky's in the same category. It's like, there are prophetic elements to the Old and New Testament that seem to stretch over much vaster spans of time. And I'm going to try to produce a rational account of that. But I mean, one of the reasons that I think the New Testament is psychologically true, let's say, is because, and this is one of the things that's deeply embedded in the structure of the Bible. In the Old Testament, there's this idea, and I'm skipping ahead, that through a succession of states, the people who behave properly will eventually establish the proper state. And so the state is viewed in some sense as the entity of salvation. But what happens in the New Testament is that idea gets, you could say, deconstructed. And instead of a state being the place of redemption, a state of being becomes the state of redemption. And so the idea that human beings will be redeemed moves from the utopian state vision to the responsibility of the individual. And I think that's correct. I mean, I believe that that's the right answer. And I think that the West in particular is predicated on that idea because it makes the state subservient to the individual. I mean, there's a what? A dialogue, a continual dialogue, but in the final analysis, the locus of the divine is the individual, not the state. And I believe that that's so true that if we don't act it out and believe it, then we all die painfully. And that's true enough for me. So, thank you. Yeah.
I Thank you for illuminating talk. I'm going to keep you on the creation story, and if you don't mind, because we know this editing that was done, there was the purpose for the editing. Can you give us your thoughts about the difference in the story of creation, especially pertaining to men, from the first chapter, which is very godlike, by a word, and to the second one, which is more like a fatherly type of creation? Is it the selling point? What was the reason for this type of editing to put the two together, one after the
Well,
other?
I think, the more cynical, what you call criticisms of the Bible and the religious tradition, criticisms like Marx's or Freud's even, for that matter, make the case that it's a manifestation of power in politics. And that there's always a political or economic motivation behind the construction of the stories. And I think that that's true to some degree. But I don't think that it's true enough so that you can take that particular interpretive tack and be done with it. And I would say that to the degree that there are political and economic motivations that have shaped the stories, the fact that multiple stories have come together, they're sort of corrective in some sense. And so even if at the level of detail, there's political intrigue and politics, say with regards to the ascendancy of Israel, when you step away from it, it becomes something that's more universal and escapes from that. And how that happened, I don't know. I mean, I think it's safe to say, it's reasonably safe to say that the people who put this document together, they did two things. I think they were guided by their aesthetic taste and their conscience. I truly believe that. And the reason I believe that is because I think anything that was propagandistic would have been forgotten. Because you can't remember propaganda. No one likes it. It's like it's dead 10 years after you write it, or 20 years. And it isn't only that these books were assembled and written, it was that they were preserved and remembered. And to me, that means they have an affinity with the structure of memory. I mean, you think about it. How does a story last 10,000 years unless it's the kind of story you can remember? It doesn't. Because you forget all the forgettable stuff, and all you remember is the memorable stuff. And so there's this interplay between the document itself and its audience that shapes the document. And so, now I don't know how specifically I answered your question. We're going to hit these different stories as they come up in sequence, and I think I'll shed some more light on the relationship between them doing that. And we'll start with that next week. Okay.
Right, so I've been really interested in a lot of the stuff that you've been saying about dreams, because I've been lucid dreaming a lot for many years, but always in a sort of atheistic way, as sort of like a game or something like that. But because of seeing your talks and everything, I've started to think of it from a different perspective, like you're now interfacing with something beyond the narrow scope of your conscious awareness, that, or something like that, maybe mythological or maybe something like God. And so what I've been thinking about, and what I maybe wondered what you think about it, is that in some ways when you're lucid dreaming, you're kind of you're getting beyond the limitations of an ordinary dream. You're sort of transcending limitations, which maybe is, like, it's not the purpose of people, right? Because as a person you're supposed to be limited in some way, as opposed to like God, who's like not limited. And how, but on the other hand, it's a good opportunity to kind of have control over your interactions with this like very special and like interesting thing. So I guess the conundrum is that on one hand, like you can control your interactions, but on the other hand, like you are controlling them. So I guess I'm wondering what do you think about that, and also just in general, what do you think about lucid dreaming as a thing? Like, should you do it, or?
I had a client who could really lucid dream, And one of the things, she used them now and then to solve problems, even though she didn't always pay attention to the answer. But sometimes she did. In one of her dreams, one of the characters told her that she would have to learn to live in a slaughterhouse. She was very afraid of life. And one of the consequences of that was that we went and watched an embalming. So the dreams were, but one of the things she did, she'd ask the characters what they were up to. She was, instead of controlling, she would inquire. And so, but I don't know what to say about lucid dreaming beyond that. Like, I know it's a well-documented phenomenon, and many people can do it, and women seem to be able to do it better than men. That's what the research indicates. But I think that what we don't know about lucid dreaming could fill a lot of books. So I think you do. There is some danger in controlling it, I think, because you lose the spontaneous revelation, although not completely, because you can't control it completely. But you see, you might be interested in reading Jung's works on active imagination, because he kind of learned to dream when he was awake. And he spent a lot of time in the world of imagination when he was awake. The Red Books, for example. The Red Book is a document of his experiences with awake dreaming. But he was very interactive with the dream, you know, instead of trying to bend it to his whim or his will. He was exploring it in some sense like you'd explore a video game, you know, which are forms of dreams in and of themselves. So, yeah, I would say do it with an exploratory purpose in mind. And you could always ask yourself what you could learn too, which is a very dangerous question to ask a dream, because sometimes you'll find out what you have to learn. That's not so pleasant, but it's really worthwhile. Okay, yeah. Okay, so I think I'm going to take 4 more questions only, because I'm running out of brain, and I don't want to say stupid things, or stupider things than I've already said. So.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. In the beginning of your lecture, you talked about how society needed this kind of dreamlike religious base so we don't go between left and right violently, and we can kind of have this base. And then you also said you admired Nietzsche for kind of chopping down these ideological and kind of dogmatic weeds coming up from the base of Christianity. I was wondering what your thoughts are on how society can have this kind of religious base without having these kind of dangerous ideologies that can spring up once in a while.
That's what I'm trying to figure out. No, really, I mean, that's the serious answer to that question. You know, I mean, the reason that I'm an admirer of Nietzsche is because he was the spirit of his times. That's a good way of thinking about it. It's not like Nietzsche killed God. It's that Nietzsche gathered what was in the air and articulated it, right, incredibly profoundly. And so he put his finger on the spot. And in doing so, he announced the problem. And once you announce the problem, then maybe you can come up with a solution, because you can't solve a problem unless you know what it is. And the fact that he made it so stark and so clear was horrifying in some sense, but at least we know where we stand. And so since then, and I would say particularly in many ways, particularly with the work of Jung and everything that's come out of that, which is the deeper study of mythology and its meanings, you know, we've been trying to address the issue that Nietzsche brought up, and trying to solve the problem. And the problem is something like the reunification of the spirit of mankind. It's something like that. Well, we're slogging through it, man, and that's why you're all here, at least in part. So we'll see how far we can get. I mean, at this rate, we'll get to like the 12th verse in the first. But that's the aim, you know. Okay. Yes, they'll be in the video. I could also make them available as slides. Yeah, well, that's okay. I'll return to this when we get going again. So.
Also, the image of the hyperlink. Do the colors have any significance?
Yeah, different colors represent the distance between the cross references. Yeah.
Is the Holy Spirit the same as the Logos?
Well, I'll talk about that more next time. I mean, I think that the best answer to that is I'll talk more about that next time. I mean, I think of them as overlapping metaphorical domains. You know, in the descriptions I put of the fatherly aspect, the son aspect, and the spirit aspect, you could swap a lot of those. You know, it's kind of arbitrary, but I think the Trinitarian idea is trying to get forward the notion that the locus of the divine it's the same thing in its essence, but it exists in a multiplicity. It exists as the spirit of tradition. It exists as the living individual in time and space, and then it exists as the spirit and as consciousness, something like that we all share, which Jung would have thought about that as something like the capacity for the individual to realize the tragedy and redemption of Christ in their individual life. And that's something like your capacity to voluntarily accept the tragic conditions of your existence and to move forward to something resembling paradise regardless of that. As something that's intrinsic to you. And I think that's associated with the idea of the Pentecost and the Holy Spirit, all of that. So that's as good as I can do in a short period of time. So, yeah. I think it's because of the gap between what we articulate and what we don't know. Something has to fill that gap. Like I think the law could replace it if the law was total, but it isn't. It's bounded and incorrect, and there's something, it has to rest on something inside that's like this mediator between what we articulate and what we don't understand. It's something like custom, it's something like expectation. It's something like the intrinsic sense of justice, that the law itself is aiming at. And those aren't fully articulated, but without them there'd be no grounding. Like, without the body, the law would be a dictionary. And if you don't know what a word means, using the dictionary is helpful, but not that helpful, because unless you've had the experience of anger, the dictionary can't tell you what anger means. It just refers to other words. But the words themselves refer to something else. And the law refers to something else. And without that, it has to be in tune with that something else and has to be in accordance with it. And so I don't think we can ever delineate the proper body of laws. And that's also why ideological utopias, see, the ideological utopias dispense with the transcendent. They say, this is what we need to do. It's like, no, you don't know. That's not good. You have to leave space for what you kind of know and for what you don't know. And I mean, in the story of the Tower of Babel, human beings make this massive building that's supposed to reach up to the heavens so that it'll take the place of God. Well, that's the earliest warning we have of the danger of making things so big that you confuse them with God. And God gets irritated and comes down and makes everybody speak different languages and scatters them. It's like, well, that's what happens when you try to make something a totality, is that it starts to fragment inside and disintegrates into catastrophe. And so it's almost as if we have to maintain this articulated space inside the dream, inside the custom, something like that, because otherwise it doesn't work. And I think that's the same as having respect for the fact that we have bodies. We're not just abstract creatures that follow rules. We're not that at all. We only follow certain rules. We won't follow the other ones, and our societies will crumble. And we just don't know enough to articulate the entire landscape of behavior with articulated rules. Not at all. We can't do it. It's beyond us. Yeah, yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. My question is also about dreams. You spoke about dreams as like a representation of truths and universal truths that can be interpreted into like myths and religion. And as you say, it's very beneficial for the individual, and it sounds like also for the society as well, because not everyone can as easily remember their dreams or interpret their dreams like that. And also it's like broadcasted to all of society for their benefit.